Hello and welcome to A Sense of Centerville in Washington Township, your place for stories about ordinary and extraordinary residents and places in the Centerville and Washington Township area. I'm Susan from Centerville-Washington History, and I look forward to hearing your story. Today, my guest is Dr. David Meyer. Dr. David Meyer was raised in a large family in a farm in northern Ohio. A Vietnam-era Air Force veteran, he is an accomplished public servant who has greatly impacted the Dayton area as a professional engineer. Dave, along with his wife, Kathleen, became a member of the Centerville-Washington History in 2015, and he joined the Board of Trustees in 2017. He has taught at The Ohio State University, the University of Dayton, and is a Professor Emeritus of Sinclair Community College. In 2020, Dave was honored as an inductee into the Ohio Veterans Hall of Fame. Thank you, Dr. David Meyer, for being here today.
My pleasure.
So we have talked several times about your experiences growing up on a farm. Could you share your background with our listeners today?
I was the oldest boy in a family of 7 kids. My father ended up working in industry and also providing food and everything from the farm. At the age of 16, my dad took a job in Marysville, Ohio, which was 100 miles away, and he would travel that distance each week and provide the resources, for the family. What he did was, because I was the oldest boy, I had all the work responsibility on the farm. That work responsibility included feeding the animals, doing the plowing, the fitting, the planting, and doing all these things. My dad would come home on the weekends, lay out the work for the next week, and then basically let me have at it, Because feeding animals and taking care of farm projects and things like that, I had very little time to study. As a result of it, in my junior year, my grades weren't the best, but yet they were passable. We ended up moving to Marysville, Ohio, and I started school as a junior. This was a turning point in our whole family.
So no more farm at this point, right?
No more farm. We basically got away from the farm. My dad sold all the animals. Eventually the farm was sold. But my dad's roots were always in the farm. They ended up buying another farm in Marysville years later. But the farming experience taught me a lot. I had a lot of early responsibility, and I ended up accepting that and doing the planning and everything else there, my time and everything else. Again, I didn't really have a lot of time for studying because I was getting up at 5:30 in the morning, doing the chores. I'd come in to go to school at around 7 o'clock. I had a 1-hour bus ride. At the end of the day, I repeated that, and by the time I got home at night and we got the animals and everything fed, it was 8 o'clock in the evening, and I was tired. I went to bed, and I had to repeat the next thing the next day. Working on a farm, it's a 24/7 operation. So we moved to Marysville. Again, major turning point. I ended up deciding my dad was very strict in what kind of education courses we took. My dad had a 2-year stint at Ohio State University, but then had to drop out due to financial reasons. My mother only went to the 8th grade. She was sent around to various families, and she just didn't have the caliber of being able to be in one place at one time. So the whole family was split apart. She had brothers and sisters, and everybody was in different places as a result of it. So my dad, being very much in favor of education, wanted me to be the example for the whole family. My sister, who was 2 years older than I am, she came to Marysville, and of course, you move to a new community 100 miles away, you don't have any friends, you've left all your friends back at the other place, and so she had a real difficult time. With me, this was my opportunity for the first time to go out and play football. And football I played. I became a halfback, running back. I played end, both offense and defense. And the farm experience, working with bales, gave me some good physical abilities that the most city kids didn't have. We ended up, my first class at Marysville, it worked out to where I always wanted to fly. And there was a little grass strip outside of Marysville. And my physics teacher really took a liking to me. And I asked him, I said, what is it that I can do to improve myself? Because I understand the Air Force will take enlisted personnel if they pass the test, and they'll send them to pilot training. He looked at me and he says, wow, let me tell you something that I was told a long time ago that will help you and anybody else. He says, there's 3 major things that you're going to have to do, and it'll take you to wherever you want to go. Number 1, you need to have faith. Faith in your teachers, faith from the religious standpoint. You got to have goals that you set, and you just don't think about your goals, you actually write them down. Then once a week, you review those goals, and you add more goals. The last item is perseverance. And what happens is, if you imagine a 3-legged stool, each one of these legs represents faith, goals, and perseverance. You remove any one of those, and that stool will be unstable. So just remember that, okay, as you go on. And he said, well, hey, if you're really interested in flying, why don't you go out to the airfield and just hang around with the pilots? So, hey, this was during the summer. I was mowing lawns and doing some other things. I ended up going out there, hanging around the airplanes, asking questions. The pilots took a liking to me. Then one day one of the pilots said, hey, I'm going up. You want to fly with me? Boy, I jumped at that. That was my first time ever in an airplane. We get up, we're flying around. He's, hey, take over. Hey, here, I'll show you how to fly. So being that I had good hands-on skills from working with farm equipment, I was getting into a subject matter that I dearly loved, and I basically was eating this up. So I ended up flying with this gentleman. Every week I'd go out there, I was flying with somebody else. And in the end, I had 4 or 5 flying hours, okay, and at the end of that time frame, I could take off and land by myself. Now, granted, these were not licensed instructors or anything like that, just people wanting to help me. So with that background, I ended up finally finishing high school. In high school, I was in the marching band. I did other kinds of things. But when I finally graduated, 1 week after high school, I enlisted in the Air Force. Now, prior to enlisting in the Air Force, they would send all candidates to take a test. And it's a 4-part test. I ended up taking this test, and after I completed it, the recruiter came back with a phone call to me and said, "You need to retake the test because something is not right." So I went to Marion, Ohio, retook the test, came back. A week later, he showed up. He wanted to talk to me and my parents. And he came in, dressed in his uniform, and he said, "Your son has got an outstanding background here. He basically has aced all 4 parts, which means that he could have any job he wants in the military." Well, this made me feel good. I thought, hey, I'm well on my way here because I wanted to become a pilot. So 1 week after high school graduation, I'm at basic training in Lackland Air Force Base. I go through the basic training, and I ask the sergeant, "Okay, I'd like to qualify for this test." And he says, "They abandoned that program here about a month ago." So I went to the recruiter at Lackland there to find out what my next step was going to be, and he said, "Well, we can sign you up for any job you want. It will not be flying." And I says, "What's the next best thing to being a pilot?" They said, "Well, we could make you a crew chief." And I said, "If you make that on a fighter bomber, I'm in." They said, "Good." So my orders indicated that, hey, I was going to be a crew chief eventually, and I was sent overseas to England for 3 years. I'm 18 years of age. And I ended up going over to England. And while I'm over in England, I'm over there about a month or so, and the staff car pulled up next to the airplane that I was working on. And a major gets out looking for me. And you've got to understand, if an officer is looking for somebody and an enlisted guy, the enlisted guy is probably in trouble. But no, that was not the case. He was looking for me, and he says, "I've got orders to take you in front of the wing commander right now." So I dropped everything, got in the car, walked in, saluted this colonel. This colonel was about my dad's age. And he said, "Airman Meyer, I'm doing something today I've never had the privilege of doing." He says, "I am awarding you this plaque from Amarillo Air Force Base as the outstanding honor graduate for the year, having to do with your high grade point average. You were competing against 4,500 other airmen going through this program in 1962. With that, I felt, gee, I've got recognition now, okay? And recognition I did have. Now, this is 1962, 1963 era. And in 1964, that's when Vietnam got really hot and heavy. They were taking all our pilots who were highly credentialized and sending them to Vietnam. However, on our field, we still had the commitment to fly the sorties and everything to back up NATO.
In England?
In England. Okay. In England. I was stationed at RAF Wethersfield, England. And what happened was we were satisfying the NATO requirements any kind of time that we had a country that was part of NATO was having conflicts or problems, okay, we'd get orders to fly in and just survey the situation, help them out in any way, shape, or form. Through the 3 years that I was overseas, I got TDY assignments, it's temporary duty, to 14 different countries. Many of those were like in Libya, Norway, France, Germany, England, Portugal, Spain, and it goes on. And we'd go there for these temporary duty assignments from anywhere from a week to maybe 3 weeks. In Tripoli, Libya, we'd go out and use that as our gunnery range, flying our missions. Planes would be loaded with ammunition, bombs, rockets, everything else. And one day, the wing commander came down and he said, "Hey, we need somebody to fly in the back seat. Would you do the honor?" I said, "Sure." So we got suited up, and that's the way I'd be dressed every time I flew in the back seat. I'd have a flight suit on, my helmet, parachute. I have a bayonet strapped to my leg. We'd be packing a .45 here up on my chest, and that's how we would fly our missions. We'd fly out into the desert, target practice, whatever else. And I really enjoyed that. Now, one thing that you have to understand, I was 19 or 20 years of age when this happened. The first time we went up, we broke the sound barrier. Every time after that, we broke the sound barrier, okay? That's part of protocol. We'd start off circling the target at 10,000 feet. Then all of a sudden, the plane would end up making a radical turn on its back, accelerate, and you're watching the desert floor come in.
Terrifying.
Then at the last moment, at around 400 or 500 feet above the terrain, they flip it over to the original configuration, so you're flying flat and level. And you're doing about 600-700 miles an hour. Now you start throttling back until you get down to 400. And then all of a sudden you find out that what happens is the platform on the fighter becomes very stable. And now you can fire the guns, the rockets, and everything with greater accuracy. So my mission in the back seat was to observe the radar screen for incoming missiles, because we were flying out in the desert, and in the desert, you still had these nomads. These people were still fighting amongst themselves like they have for the last 1,000 years, okay? And the idea is that if we had a plane that went down, you might have to use your revolver, you might have to use your bayonet.
To protect yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So all the time I was doing this, I was not allowed to tell my parents what I was doing. The military has certain protocol. They don't want you to tell where you are at, where you're going.
Keep you safe.
And keeping everybody safe.
Yeah.
So I ended up monitoring what they were looking for. And I'd got up in the back seat of the fighter bomber numerous times. And there the fighter is loaded with rockets. There's also some napalm located underneath the center line. And so that's the way I'd go up dressed, okay. I'd mentioned there how we broke the speed of sound. Mm-hmm. And I ended up getting this nice pin from North American Aviation that showed that I did exceed the speed of sound. We ended up doing these kinds of maneuvers all the time, and most of all in Tripoli, Libya. Along the way, the wing commander knew me really well, and they had a lot of confidence in me. In 1964, the wing commander invited me in. He says, "Hey, we have a NATO competition. He is allowed to only send one crew chief into this competition." And he asked me if I'd do the pleasure. I said, sure. I was sent to Norway for practice, to Germany for practice, and finally we ended up at Chaumont Air Base in France. And while we were there, I got to talking to the pilot, and I said, hey, is there anything that we could do to the airplane that'll increase your performance? He said, yeah, there's a few things. He says, when he comes in, he throttles back to 400 knots to stabilize the platform. And he says, the guns that I'm going to be firing, I'd like to have them reconfigured. Now, you got 4 guns, 4 20-millimeter cannons, and 2 on the outside, 2 on the inside, okay? And he said, the 2 on the inside, I'd like to have those bullets path cross further on out. The ones on the outside, I'd like to have those cross further on the inside. So with that information, when we went to the bore sight range to set up the guns and everything, that's what we did. We just set the things up the way the pilot wanted. And he said, there's another thing that we do. He says, when he fires the guns, he wants to get the heck out of there as quickly as possible. So can you do anything to the engine? I said, sure. We'll boost the power on it. Okay. He says, fantastic. So he went through this competition. Now, we were competing with 7 different nations, the NATO nations. We had 2 different teams. And when we finally ended up scoring all the hits and everything that this pilot had made, this pilot's name was Lieutenant Lloydwood from Youngstown, Ohio. He ended up outscoring everybody. I mean, not just a little bit, but everywhere. In the Air Force magazine, USAFE newspaper, it said headlines. Top gun in the world, Lieutenant Lloydwood. Now, this is long before the Top Gun show, okay? So, I mean, this was in 1964. So he ends up becoming the Top Gun guy, and he still holds that award today.
The first Top Gun, huh?
first Top Gun, okay? And I played a part of it, okay? Later on, they wanted to know how it was that his plane was able to outperform everything else. And all his comment was, you have to talk to the crew chief.
The crew chief made it happen. Yep.
So anyway, that was an assignment that I had. I had some other assignments. I was into Cambodia for less than 24 hours. And there's nothing I could do about it, okay? We flew in, flight of 8, landed. It's about 7 o'clock in the evening. We're listening to the news, and on the news, the President of the United States comes out and says, we are not in Cambodia. I'm looking around, I'm thinking, where the heck are we?
I thought we were in Cambodia.
All of a sudden, the wing commander comes up, and they confiscate all our orders so that there was no evidence. So we were written the edict there that we were going to be leaving tomorrow morning, okay, at 3 o'clock in the morning. So he said, you better get to bed because we got a big day tomorrow. Well, I'm telling you what, 3 o'clock in the morning, the planes are out at the end of the runway. We're getting ready to make our taxi roll. Okay. I look around. I remember what this professor talked about. Faith, goals, perception. Trust me, when you're sitting out the end of the runway and they told us that there was going to be ground fire coming in all over the place, you had better believe that faith comes in the mind.
For sure, yeah.
And my goal was to do my job the very best I could possibly do, and nobody was going to change me. That's the perseverance.
Yeah, definitely.
So we start our takeoff roll, we get going, catching ground fire, and it's the first time we had experienced that.
I'm sure it's terrifying.
Yeah. Bullets grazing the canopy. Okay. Everybody kept saying, were you scared? I'm going to tell you something. I was so busy doing my job, I didn't have time to be scared. We start our pull-out on the radar screen. There's an incoming SAM missile coming in. We avoid that, and we just basically poured the power to it and just got the heck out of there. Okay, we went and flew into Vietnam there for less than a day or two, and then we headed on back home because we were not supposed to be there. But I can tell you, all the experiences that I had up until that point, I used, including my farming experience. So we did that. I came back home to the base in England, and then all of a sudden, there's other opportunities coming up. And other TDYs, did those. And finally, it's about 2 months before I'm ready to leave the military, and they send me in for my review for my reenlistment talk, okay? And I had no interest at all in staying in. I just got tired of being shot at and not being able to defend myself. So I ended up getting out. No sooner did I get out in December of '65 that in January they introduced a brand new GI Bill for Vietnam-era veterans. Well, as a farm kid with very little education, my dad was working, providing for the family. There was no extra money for college for me. That was my ticket. And I jumped on that, and I started Ohio State in the summer of 1966. And I never looked back. My military has been my backbone as far as my education experience goes. I ended up finally graduating in industrial engineering technology. Along the way, I met my wife. She was a nurse there at Ohio State University Hospital. Today, we've got 3 great kids and 10 grandkids. Fantastic feelings. So I ended up finishing up at Ohio State. While I was going to Ohio State, I was finishing up my private pilot's license. And in 1964, I became a licensed pilot. And I've been a licensed pilot now like that for like over 55 years. So I did get my dream, but my dream when I first was going into college, I wanted to fly for the airlines. But in 1966, when I was getting out, there was an awful lot of pilots that had thousands of hours of flying time who were considered more highly credible than what me. I only had a couple hundred hours. I was paying for all my time. All their time was paid for by the military.
Yeah.
So I ended up passing up on flying. I did it as a hobby. I worked in industry. I worked for industry for 33 years. Along the way, I ended up doing a lot of different things. I ended up getting patents.
Well, you showed me this yesterday, and I thought it was very fun to see a real patent. I'll hold it up.
Okay.
So that's what a real patent looks like. And then can I open it up as well?
Sure.
Oop, I don't want to rip it.
Yeah.
It has drawings inside.
A patent, everybody thinks, oh, gee, I've got an idea, I can get a patent. It doesn't work that way. What certifies a patent are the claims. The more claims that you can get, the stronger the patent. And you need strength to avoid people from coming in and undercutting you, because there's all kinds of people out there looking at the patents and trying to redesign things to get their own patents. So it does take a creative way of doing this, and my best advice is to see a strong patent lawyer and let them lead the way for you. But I have received a total of 3 different patents in my lifetime, and this one here is a patent on a tool that they use in the metal stamping industry. And the beauty of this thing was that you could remove this tool in a matter of 30 seconds, whereas the old way of doing it, you had to drop the entire die and everything else, take it apart, and you're looking at 4 or 5 hours of work. So that was one of my patents.
So creativity,
that's
and
right.
engineering.
Yeah.
That's what gets you patents.
And I'm working, I can go back and relate to what I did on the farm. On the farm, we didn't have a welder, we didn't have anything like that. We did a lot of work with baling wire and just bolting things together, okay? And I can go and I can relate that, gee, when you start having all the right mechanisms for doing these kinds of things, it just makes life so much easier. But it also makes it difficult for getting a patent because anybody can duplicate it. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I brought that in.
Oh, that's great.
And I ended up doing other things in industry along the way.
Talk about what brought you to Dayton.
Okay. When I first got out of college, I ended up working in industry, in the steel industry in the Pittsburgh area. And in 1982, we had an economic situation in this country which actually wiped out the steel industry in the Pittsburgh area, Youngstown, Wheeling, West Virginia, everywhere. What happened is the economy downturn forced everybody out of a job. I lost my job. I was one of 80-some thousand employees that lost my job in that era. So I was in the steel industry, but I also had a strong statistical process control background. I was noted for problem solving, for managing skills. The military taught me management skills, how to get things done with people. And I ended up interviewing, trying to get a job after I lost my job in the Wheeling area to no avail. So I started looking in Columbus, Dayton, and Cincinnati. And I ended up getting a job working as a plant manager for Baxter Healthcare. Now think of the transition going from the steel industry to healthcare. What's the correlation? There is none. Okay, the only thing that brought me there was the fact that I had a strong statistical background in quality control. I also was a registered professional engineer. Now, I found out later on that there was over 700 candidates who had sent in their resumes trying to get this job. They interviewed, they were talking about putting this job posting in the Wall Street Journal and other places. So when I went in to interview, the interview was kind of different. Everybody was very receptive. They wanted to know about my background. They wanted to know how I was going to end up helping the healthcare area, okay, from the steel industry. And still the people there just didn't understand what a professional engineer, and with my background in science, math, physics, chemistry, and all of these other disciplines, how all that stuff evolves. But they soon found out. I was offered a job, and my job pay increased by a factor of 3 times what I was being paid in the steel industry.
So I'm sure your family was happy. That helped to raise some family.
Everybody was happy, except for now I was spending a lot of time on the road doing all kinds of things. I went to Lestovic, Yugoslavia, Spain, Belgium, a lot of time in California, back and forth. So But when I found out from the human resource manager got a hold of me one day, and he says, you have proven out to be all right. We had our doubts going into this, but your mission was to satisfy the problem that our whole organization had, and that was 60% of our sales are in IV solutions. And the Food and Drug Administration was going to shut us down on all our plants. And you came on the scene indicating that you could help. Well, we had our doubts, but hey, you satisfied and found out what the problem was. They sent you into operating rooms. They sent you into all different kinds of applications where IV solutions were being used. You were doing a lot of testing, and quite frankly, talking to the people that were reporting to you, you were asking them to do things that they didn't understand. But in the end, after a 9-month time frame, you had the issue resolved that the plastic bags that the IV solutions were in, the salts in that plastic were being brought out in a short period of time, and they were contaminating the IV solutions. So he says it was funny because when they first put the IV solutions in, they were fine. But if they were left in the bag for a period of like a week or two, it took that length of time for the salts to be brought out and to contaminate the solution. So long story short, saved the day.
That's what engineers do, is they save the day.
Saved the day. We ended up, all 3 plants were up and operating. The efficiencies of the quality level went up to like 99 point whatever percent.
And that saves money. So that's where your value is.
And
yeah.
It saves money. Okay. Mm-hmm. So here I did that at Baxter Healthcare. Mm-hmm. And then I ended up making that transition from steel to healthcare. Mm-hmm. And but it was my plastic background that I'd had when I was in high school. I just played around with plastic items and gluing things together, and
understanding the medium.
I had courses in industrial arts and working with plastics. So anyway, when I ended up finishing up with this IV solution dilemma, they wanted me to work on other projects, and that was latex and vinyl gloves. And along the way, American Pharmaceutical was purchased by Baxter. Baxter was like a $2 billion a year organization, and they were buying a $6 billion a year organization. That made Wall Street history. But what happened was the people who were in control of American Pharmaceutical just did not have it. Okay, they were relying on people like myself. So when they finally took over and Baxter completed the sale, Baxter, for whatever reason, turned all the manufacturing plants over to American Pharmaceutical, which was, to me, the biggest mistake they could have ever made. You know, they were looking at quantity of manufacturing companies and not quality of the people making things happen. So they ended up completing that deal. The guy that I was reporting to now, out in California, had a 2-year associate degree, and here I am, a professional engineer, reporting to this guy, and they kept making all kinds of changes. At the same time, when I went to work for Baxter, we were just completing the startup of a glove plant in South Carolina. And we had worked out all the details, the Food and Drug Administration, everything was taken care of. And we were making good quality product. But now, this new organization wanted to take the same drawings that we had, and they wanted to duplicate 3 plants in Malaysia. Malaysia is where latex rubber comes from.
Right.
So we were trying to get closer to the source. So we ended up, I went out to California many a time. But these clowns out there, I'm going to call them clowns without another word, explicit word. Mm-hmm. These clowns basically were trying to modify everything that we already had that was already proven. Mm-hmm. And when you do that, you create catastrophic problems. So much so, when they offered me the job out there, I turned it down. I didn't like the idea of my kids going out to California and learning their ways. I just didn't care for it. Okay, I wanted my kids to have Midwestern values.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we stayed in Dayton, Ohio. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, I get a job at Dayton Progress Corporation. I'm a project engineer. Enjoyed the job, designing equipment. I ended up getting patents.
When did your master's and PhD happen?
Okay. What I did was, when I left Dayton Progress, I was still working at Dayton Progress, but then the University of Dayton asked me to teach. Mm-hmm. And I did. And then Sinclair came along and offered me a full-time position where I could head up the whole engineering technology program. And while I was there at Sinclair, they offered me, more education, and they were willing to pay 80% of my fees, if I took on a Master's of Business Administration. So I did this, and I finished that program, and along the way, when I finished that, I said, hey, can I go on? They said, sure. So I said, how about a PhD program at Ohio State? They said, fine, because I was now starting to teach part-time also at Ohio State. So,
what was your PhD in?
Industrial Engineering Technology.
Okay.
Yeah. And my dissertation is about that thick, and it's in the field of plastics. Uh-huh. Again, that's plastics, part of my background, that I had. I set up at Sinclair the entire plastics program, teaching the curriculum, writing the curriculum, doing it. And so it was a natural for me to get into the plastics industry. Now, interesting, the plastics field, if you look at gross domestic product in the state of Ohio, it's the plastics field which will hold that reign. And so anybody who's interested in a lifelong career, you need to get into the plastics industry because it is growing 2% per year, and it's been doing that over the last 100 years.
There's a lot of things that can be made out of plastics, for sure.
Everything is made out of plastics, and they do that to reduce the cost. Take it from metal to plastic, Mm-hmm. So I ended up getting my PhD, and I ended up continuing teaching.
So history. Tell me about your tractor. So you have, is it 1961? Okay.
1961 Massey Ferguson tractor. Mm-hmm. High wheel. This was designed for the tobacco industry, so the wheels set extra high. A friend of my son's made a comment that they had this tractor that they were trying to get rid of, located in Michigan. And I expressed an interest. I said, well, tell me about it. Is it got a lot of rust on it? What is it runnable? All this stuff. And they showed me a picture of it, and so I made a trip up to Michigan to look at it. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, what are you asking for this? Well, he said, we had a guy out of Kentucky who wanted to buy it 3 years ago, but he never came across with the money. He says, we were trying to get $1,500 out of it. I wrote a check that moment. I bought it. I brought it back here, and I use it to cut my grass on an 1.5 acre plot that I have in Kettering.
And also, for many years, it it carried our float down the Americana Parade, which was what the claim to fame in the history department is. That
I ended up taking this tractor, okay, and I redid the ignition system because things were not quite there. Redid that, repainted it, and it looks like it's close to being showroom, but very colorful, and it sets up very high. And I'm just proud of it because as a farm kid, hey, that's
it reminds you of your growing up years.
Growing up in my youth, yeah.
Now, one thing we didn't talk about yesterday, and we're out of time, but could you briefly talk? When I first met you working for Centerville-Washington History, you said you do reenactments, dressing up in...
For the 4th of July parade that we have, not only do I drive my tractor with the float, but I station myself in front of the museum, and I dress up like Davy Crockett. I got a coonskin cap. I've got an 1850 cap-lock rifle, and it's just all old. And I try to lure the people walking by to visit the museum. I get the kids who are walking with their parents. I show them arrowheads that I found on my property. I show them different kinds of things like the size of the ball, the bullet that goes into the rifle. And I just try to develop some curiosity from everybody's standpoint. And then I've got a Bowie knife that I made. It's like 16 inches long, and I made that out of an old hacksaw blade. But it looks authentic, nice handle and everything else. And I show this to the kids, and they are in awe. Oh my gosh, this is.
Yeah. That's. It's nice to have some historical things.
And so that's how I pay tribute, okay, to the town of Centerville, the Historical Society, and it's just fun activity, okay, to get these younger generations involved in history.
And what history was like.
And now it's interesting. You think history. If you think about it, when I was in industry, I'd be receiving 35 to 45 industrial publications a month, okay, having to do with what was going on back in that era. Back in that era, that's today history, okay? And it's interesting, you start looking at these magazines and it develops ideas that you can use and apply in your place of work, okay? And before long, you start accumulating some of these things and you can make a lot of process improvements and reduce people's costs. For those people looking for a job, number one on the list is, can you prove on your resume that you can reduce costs for manufacturers or wherever you go to work at? If you can prove that, you're going to get the offer.
And that gets back to, what the topic is for you, is that education has made your life improved, and we want to continue to encourage a younger generation to learn about history and to get an education. But before we close, I really want to make sure to show these last two items that we have here. So go ahead and show that, and I'll hold it while you tell the story, because I thought this was fascinating. We couldn't not share this.
At Sinclair, I started off in the year 2000, and 2003 was going to be the celebration of 100 years of powered flight. Being a pilot, I ended up taking it on that, hey, we want to embed a small miniaturized copy of the Wright Flyer. We then contacted NASA wanting to know if we could finally get something like this put up on the space shuttle. They came back to us and they said, yeah, there's a possibility. Well, there was a big lull in the whole flight possibility. There was an accident, so everything was slowed down there. But in the meantime, we kept working on this thing to get it down to where we could set it up on the flight. Finally, NASA came down and they wanted to know what the weight was of these units. Well, some of these things were quite large. They weighed like a pound or whatever else. Finally, NASA came back and they said, we will be able to take something up on flight if it is 1 ounce or less.
I don't think that's this. This feels a little heavier than that.
Well, that's the embedded version. But,
Okay.
But the original version, it weighed in at less than 1 ounce. So less than a postage card, okay? Mm-hmm. And we had, over a 3-year period, we had 250 students, okay, that were involved in this, writing letters to congressmen about what we're going to do. Finally, this thing went up on a flight, and
then this, I don't know if we mentioned that this is a Wright Flyer.
Yes.
The original Wright Flyer, and injected into
this is embedded.
Embedded,
Yes.
Into, is this plastics?
It's yes.
Yes, of course, it had to be plastics, right?
Embedded into plastics. Okay, so if you look at it, everything that I've been able to do over my career, okay, kind of played a part for making that happen.
Yeah. We also have to show this. This is Dr. David G. Meyer into the Veterans Hall of Fame. And when was this? 2020, November 2020.
2020.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
This is very important. Everybody who's a veteran is eligible for this. You have to understand, though, you need to be recommended by party. You have to fill out a lot of forms and everything else. They look at your background. They are looking for things that you did not while you were in the service, but outside of service.
Okay.
So everything that I did, Historical Society, anything that I did for other people, organizations, things like that, all qualified. Mm-hmm. There are over 800,000 veterans eligible, and every year they pick 20 people.
So this really is an honor to be inducted into the Hall of Fame.
And this is signed by Governor DeWine.
Oh, look at that.
John Husted, and they have a big ceremony when you receive this. Quite an honor.
Where do you keep this in your house?
I keep it in my house, in my library.
In your library?
Yes.
Okay.
By the way, my library, I've got over 4,000 books.
Well, that sounds like a great library, and you like to read.
Yeah.
Well, it's been so nice having you here today and to share some of your experiences, both in industry and in the military, and also sharing your perspectives on getting an education and how important that is, for your future in doing what you enjoy to do.
Sure.
And I also know Dave loves to help people, and he's always there to contribute to the history as well. So thank you so much for being here today and for your contributions. And also a thank you to Miami Valley Communications Council for helping to produce this podcast. If you have an interesting story about Centerville or Washington Township, please contact Centerville-Washington History. Please also come visit our museums Tuesday through Friday, 12 o'clock to 4 p.m. in Uptown Centerville. And watch on Facebook and Instagram for events that are coming. Follow our website at CentervilleWashingtonHistory.org. Thank you and goodbye.